Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. The human voice is amazing. It's the most complex instrument out there, capable of reproducing a wider variety of sounds than anything else we've ever made, with the possible exception of the synthesizer. Unlike synths, though, the voice is totally acoustic and innate, built into the human body by nature itself. There's no knobs, no settings, just raw, primal sound. This instinctive nature makes it hard for music theorists to talk about, but since the voice is unambiguously the most important instrument in modern popular music, if we want our work to actually mean anything, we're gonna have to give it a shot. This video is sponsored by CuriosityStream. In a 1972 essay, French philosopher Roland Barthes described what he called the grain of the voice, or the part of the vocal sound that's not connected to language. In Barthes' words,
"The grain is the body in the voice as it sings, the hand as it writes, the limb as it performs."
Effectively, the grain is the physicality of the voice, the sound of the body that produces it. Of course, every instrument is to some extent physical. You can hear a guitarist slide their finger across a string, a drummer pound their foot on the kick pedal, or a thereminist make spooky noises with their hands. But the voice is one of the few musical sounds produced entirely by the human body, unmediated by any outside tool except... well, we'll get there. This connection to the body makes the voice a perfect vehicle for communicating an individual's identity. Every body is different, so every voice will be different too. To quote musicologist Sheila Whiteley,
"The voice most explicitly expresses a performer's personality and orally signals their presence within the music."
In a very real way, your voice is you. No one else has it, and the way you choose to use it tells listeners a lot about who you are. And while the voice conveys identity, it can also convey culture. Different styles of music will often adopt specific vocal practices, like the infamous pop-punk voice. Compare Tom DeLonge to Dexter Holland, or Pierre Bouvier. Each one is different, but there's clear similarities in tone, phrasing, and other vocal aspects. In this, we see that the grain of the voice communicates not just how the singer's body is shaped, but who inhabits that body. Of course, it's important not to get too essentialist about this. There are pop-punk singers who don't use the voice, like Matt Skiba, and artists from other genres who kinda do, like Vance Joy. Still though, it's clear that these vocal traits are unusually common within the culture of pop-punk, and many other styles have their own similar collections. At this point, I think it's worth taking a second to look at how exactly the body produces a voice, because understanding the mechanisms is going to make it a lot easier to understand the impact. Sounds Good already made an amazing video about this, link in the description if you want all the details, but the short version is that air from your lungs vibrates your vocal cords, these little flappy bits inside your larynx, to generate a frequency. From there, that sound bounces around in various open cavities inside your body, filling out the sound by adding extra harmonic frequencies on top. You can think of it like the resonance chamber of an acoustic guitar, but gross. You then shape those frequencies with the position of your tongue, lips, and other parts of your vocal tract, amplifying some harmonics and dampening others, and all those factors combine to form your voice. Or at least to form vowels. Consonants are way more complicated and each one has its own technique, but I said this was going to be the short version. If you want more, watch the Sounds Good video. We've got other work to do. All these complex internal mechanisms present a unique problem for vocal instructors. In a guitar lesson, if your hand is positioned wrong, your teacher can see the mistake, demonstrate the correct technique, and you can mimic them exactly, all without anyone actually playing a note. But the voice doesn't work like that. In the words of my old vocal tech teacher, I can't open up the back of my throat and show you what my vocal cords are doing, and even if I could, it wouldn't help unless you could see your own in the same way. We can do some things by touch, but most of your vocal apparatus is just hidden from the outside world with no easy way to access it. As such, vocal instruction tends to rely heavily on imagery and metaphor, and that translates to the way we discuss the voice in general. Voices are more about vague feelings than precise, quantifiable characteristics, which makes it hard for theorists to build good models for analyzing them. But that doesn't mean we can't try, which brings me to a model described by Dr. Victoria Malawe in her book A Blaze of Light in Every Word. Her goal is to give us a clear, well-defined framework for describing and categorizing voices, and to do that, she breaks the grain up into 3 overlapping domains. The first and most obvious is the domain of pitch. Now, to be clear, I don't mean melody. We don't care if the note is, say, the flat 6 of the key or what intervals the singer is moving in. No, for our purposes, this is more about things like range. Low voices like Johnny Cash,
"We fired our guns and a British kept a-comin',"
convey things like authority, seriousness, and maturity, while high voices like Ad Rock more commonly represent energy, youth, and vulnerability. Like many of the characteristics we'll be discussing, range exists on a spectrum. Cash and ad rock are both relatively extreme examples, but most vocalists will sit somewhere in the middle, dipping down to low notes when they need more weight, and jumping to high notes when they get excited. Another important pitch characteristic is intonation. This is, in effect, a singer's attitude towards pitch. Some singers are really precise, like Amy Lee, while others just sort of get in the right area, like Johnny Rotten. This is often associated with genre. Precise intonation requires a lot of training, so you see it most commonly in classical and some kinds of jazz where you really want the audience to hear all the hours you spent practicing. In punk and rock, on the other hand, singing a little bit flat can convey a sense of authenticity and rawness that brings the vocal performance to life. At the extreme end, you even have straight-up speech like John McCrae.
They deftly maneuver and muscle for rank,
where the intonation is completely approximate with a melodic contour but no clear notes. It's tempting to ascribe value judgments to this sort of thing, talking about good intonation and bad intonation, but I want to be really careful about that because all of these approaches can be effective if they're used well. Adam Neely did a video where he auto-tuned Robert Plant and other famous singers, link in the description, and you can really hear how, when the intonation is technically perfect, the performance loses some of its charm. And then there's vibrato. This is when, instead of just holding a note straight like Katy Perry,
shine.
You add a little flutter, alternating rapidly with a slightly lower pitch like Freddie Mercury.
But I just can't get no relief, Lord.
Like intonation, vibrato is associated with training, especially training in the European classical tradition, although it also shows up a lot in jazz. It requires a lot of control, so a good, clear vibrato tells you the singer is a real professional vocalist. Or at least that's the implication. Again, it's easy to attach value judgments to this, but despite what some vocal teachers may tell you, vibrato's not stylistically appropriate for every song. Singing without vibrato isn't a mistake, it's a choice, and that choice tells us a lot about what the voice is communicating. The second domain is prosody, which is the pacing and flow of vocal delivery. And yes, I chose the word flow very carefully there because, as we'll see, the hip-hop concept of flow is pretty directly related to prosody. The central parameter of this domain is phrasing, which we can think of in roughly the same terms we'd use for instrumental phrasing. How long are the phrases, how connected are the phrases, and how connected are the notes within a phrase. On one end, you have short, choppy phrases with clear spaces in between, like Chris Barron, communicating passion and urgency. On the other, you have long phrases with imperceptible boundaries, like Serge Tankian,
following direction when to clamp down with your iron fist, drugs become conveniently available for all the kids,
conveying, in this case at least, a sort of calm, sneering detachment. And of course, there's plenty of space in between. This clip from Adele
I let it fall, my heart.
has short, clearly separated phrases, but the notes themselves are fairly well connected. Phrasing is one of those parameters that can be hard to nail down because more than anything else we've seen so far, it can change drastically even over the course of a single song. Compare Adam Levine's flowing, well-connected phrases in the verse of This Love
I was so high I did not recognize the fire burning in her eyes.
to the choppy syllable-by-syllable delivery in the chorus.
This love has taken its toll on me.
That said, many singers demonstrate a fairly consistent approach to phrasing throughout their work, so while we do have to be careful not to over-specify, looking at phrasing can still tell us something about an artist's voice. It can even tell us something about genre conventions. Consider this call and response from Marvin Gaye,
Can I get up with me? Can I get up with me?
reflecting the clear influence of gospel music. Beyond phrasing, another important characteristic of prosody is metric placement, or the vocalist's attitude toward the beat. This can occur on lots of different levels. When I was working on the Carry On Wayward Son video, one thing I noticed was that throughout the song, Steve Walsh begins every vocal phrase on beat 2.
Once I rose above the noise and confusion.
This makes him feel slightly disconnected from the downbeat, less action and more reaction. Metric placement also includes syncopation, like we hear from Bruno Mars.
put your pinky rings up to the moon.
The use of Scotch snaps, or notes on the first 2/16 of the beat, gives it a jagged sort of energy and excitement that would be utterly lost if they just sang straight eighths instead. And then there's microrhythms, or rhythmic adjustments too small to be captured by traditional notation. You can think of this as like intonation, but for rhythm. Most of the examples we've heard so far are pretty much on the beat, but if you listen to Killer Mike,
The log to fire, the non-complier, the death to fire, the Mike Myers, murder rapper for hire.
you'll hear that in this verse at least, he's slightly behind. sound. Not enough to really feel syncopated, but enough to convey a sense of groove and swagger that sets his vocals apart. These sorts of micro-rhythmic adjustments are especially common in hip-hop vocals. At the extreme end, you have artists like MF Doom,
So nasty that it's probably somewhat of a travesty having me. Then he told the people you can call me your majesty.
who rap around the beat with very little direct connection, giving it this loose improvisational feel as if he's making it up as he goes. It's really hard to do, but when it's done well, it can be a revelation. And the last parameter of prosody is what Malawi calls motility, or the ability to make quick, controlled changes. This, again, manifests in many different ways depending on genre and artist. It could be Beyonce's smooth, precise runs, Tech Nine's machine gun lyrical delivery,
Give me the knocking, I'm a chopper. He came in and went tomorrow, but I'ma lock it down and hop in the pocket like empanadas.
or Vince Neil seamlessly transitioning between registers. Because motility can take so many different forms, analyzing its impact is less about whether a vocalist has it and more about how they use it. Across the board, higher motility reflects technical prowess, but the specific ways in which an artist or genre chooses to demonstrate that prowess provides insight into what the artist or genre values. Let's consider our three examples. In R&B, fluctuations in pitch are often used to communicate intense emotion, so a singer like Beyonce needs to be able to quickly move through different notes to get her point across. In hip-hop, there tends to be an emphasis on lyricism, so Tech Nine's rapid delivery allows him to demonstrate mastery over his words. In glam metal, the use of powerful high notes to convey hyper-masculine virility rewards Vince Neil for being able to flip up an octave at a moment's notice. The actual sounds are very different, but the underlying principle is the same, and we can gain a lot of insight by looking at which aspects of motility these artists choose to show off. The third domain is quality, or the actual tone of the voice, and this is where things get tricky. We can measure pitch and prosody pretty precisely, but quality doesn't work like that. It's not as simple as adding these frequencies results in this change in tone. Our perception of vocal quality depends heavily on context, personal experience, and our understanding of vocal physicality. There's so many possible parameters that deciding which ones to care about is probably impossible, but we're gonna try anyway because we're music theorists. That's what we do. Before we do, though, let's talk a bit about timbre in general. To wildly oversimplify, timbre is basically the frequency spectrum of a given note. At the bottom, we have the fundamental frequency, which defines the pitch we hear. Above that, we have overtones, which I'll split into two categories. Harmonic overtones are frequencies that are an exact multiple of our fundamental, so if we start with 220 Hz, our harmonics would be 440, 660, 880, and so on. These sound in harmony with the fundamental. Inharmonic overtones, on the other hand, are any other frequency. If I take that stack from before and add an overtone at 500 Hz, you can hear the inharmonicity. It makes the sound noisier and less clearly structured. With that in mind, our first parameter is phonation, or how tense the vocal cords are. This exists on a spectrum. In the middle, you have a clear, relaxed open tone like Bill Withers.
Ain't no sunshine when she's gone.
In Western music, this tends to be the neutral default tone for most singers. If you relax your throat even more, you wind up with a breathy tone like Dido.
I know you think that.
Characterized by weaker harmonics and the presence of a light, airy hiss as excess air escapes through vocal cords that aren't fully engaged. Breathiness can communicate feelings of intimacy, relaxation, or in some cases a loss of control. On the other hand, if you add more tension, you get a rough, raspy, throaty sound like Bruce Springsteen, including the addition of subharmonics, or frequencies below the intended fundamental, which distorts the sound and complicates our perception of pitch. Depending on context, this tense sound can convey anger, excitement, eroticism, or due to its association with smoking and drinking, it can convey experience with the seedy side of life. Another important parameter is buzziness, or the addition of inharmonic overtones due to resonance in the nasal cavities. Compare the relatively clear vocals of Taylor Swift to the king of nasal singing, Bob Dylan.
How many roads must a man walk down?
In between, you have voices like Jungkook,
Like butter, like a criminal undercover.
where there's a clear, masky brightness without being quite as closed off as Dylan. Buzzy voices sound distinctive, and the bright frequencies help cut through the surrounding noise, but in classical Western singing, a nasal tone is considered unpleasant, so leaning too hard into it can make you sound like an amateur, which may be exactly what you're going for. Dylan's a folk singer, so it makes perfect sense to choose a voice that wouldn't elevate him above his listeners. And it's worth noting that other cultures have different attitudes towards this sort of voice. If we listen to a Bulgarian women's choir, all the vocals are fairly buzzy, which is considered good and normal in that tradition. I bring this up because it's important to remember that there is no one ideal voice. The sounds we think of as beautiful are, for the most part, culturally determined, and other parts of the world find beauty in different things. Our next quality parameter is paralinguistic features. This is when a singer uses aspects of their voice to imply some sort of non-musical vocalization, which sounds way more complicated than it is. Basically, it's stuff like Sturgill Simpson sounding like he's crying.
I'm sorry, but I'm just thinking the right words to say.
Janet Jackson dropping to a whisper. Or Dave Williams screaming his head off. Paralinguistic features tie into our understandings of what these sounds mean in normal interactions. Simpson is sad, Jackson is intimate, and Williams is angry. We're very good at recognizing nonverbal cues in people's voices, so borrowing the vocal qualities of those cues is a great way to quickly communicate a primal emotion in a way that most people will understand. So we have our three primary domains of pitch, prosody, and quality, but we're not done yet. We also have to look at the overlap. For example, the domains of pitch and quality intersect when we're talking about register. The way you physically produce your voice changes depending on whether the notes are high, low, or somewhere in the middle. Compare John Legend's lower register
I can't pin you down
to his upper register from the same song. Not only are the notes different, the timbre is too. He wouldn't be able to reproduce that rich, thick tone from the low notes in such a high part of his voice, and he couldn't bring that soft falsetto tone down low either. As we've discussed, these qualities shape the emotional character of the voice, so choosing which register to sing in can have a profound impact not just on pitch, but on tone as well. Pitch also overlaps with prosody in the form of embellishments. We already talked about melisma, or vocal runs, but the other main example of this is pitch bends, like we hear from Katie Lang.
Well, it goes like this, the fourth, the fifth.
In both cases, pitch is being used to manipulate and emphasize the phrasing. These sorts of embellishments can tie phrases together by bridging the space between them, or they can separate phrases by drawing more attention to the boundaries. As always, it depends how they're used. As for prosody and quality, those mostly overlap in the discussion of onsets, or how you begin a note. Remember how I said at the beginning that consonants were weird and I didn't want to get into them? Well, here we are. Emphasizing consonants, especially hard ones like T, P, and K, creates clear percussive moments that cut off the previous note, like we hear from Mick Jones.
It's always tease, tease, tease.
While softening them helps connect the notes into one long line in exchange for being a little harder to understand, like Rob Zombie. Onsets also cover what are called timbral embellishments, where a singer leans into a vocal effect at the beginning of a note before quickly returning to a more neutral tone, like James Labrie, who gets raspy for the onsets but leaves the rest of it fairly clean. Onsets can be hard to analyze because they go by so quickly, but changing your approach to them can fundamentally change the sound of a vocal delivery. Up to now, we've been talking as if when you hear a voice, you're hearing the body of the performer, and that's a reasonable assumption, but it's not quite true. This may seem obvious, but every example I've played so far in this video was recorded into a microphone. Shocking, I know, but that's kind of a huge deal. Different microphones work differently, and they do better or worse at picking up different frequency bands. This is me on my studio mic,
and this is me on my gaming headset.
Mic selection has a significant impact on how vocals sound, as does mic technique. Were they singing directly into the mic or over top of it? How close was it to their mouth? All of that will change the final product, and so will the speakers. If you're watching this video with cheap Bluetooth earbuds, you're probably missing out on the lower frequencies that give many of these voices their distinctive qualities. And even if you're hearing a voice live with no amplification, it'll still be affected by the acoustics of the space they're singing in, as well as your own ears. So yes, it's still true that the grain of the voice reflects the sound of the singer's body, but it's not quite true that that sound is unmediated. There will always be physical or technological barriers in the way. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Modern recording technology offers us all sorts of ways to actively manipulate the grain of a singer's voice after it's been recorded. I don't want to run through every type of plugin out there, so instead I'll break these up into two types. First, you have tools. These are things the audience isn't meant to hear, like EQ, compression, and pitch pitch correction. We can think of these as polishing the grain of the voice, creating an idealized version of the singer's intended body. It's no longer their voice, but it's still clearly a voice. The other category is effects, which are things your audience is supposed to hear, like echoes, distortion, and overt auto-tune. These obscure the grain, creating a new composite body that's part human, part machine, which, okay, maybe this body metaphor is getting a bit stretched, but as a counterpoint, cyborg voice. Beep boop. Alright, so finally we've got all our parameters. What do we do with them? Well, now we've got to analyze the voice. And that, I think, is a really important point. This whole thing is a framework for analysis, but it's not itself analysis. Identifying how a vocalist interacts with each of our domains is kind of like labeling chords. It tells you what's happening, but it's up to you, the theorists, to work out what it means. And that can be tricky with vocal analysis because the impact of the voice is multidimensional and non-linear. There's so many parameters to consider, and they all interact. Frank Ocean's use of high notes doesn't have the same impact as Bruce Dickinson's. And not only do these parameters interact with each other, they also interact with our understanding of culture. We've learned to associate certain combinations of vocal characteristics with certain emotions, attitudes, genres, cultures, ages, races, and genders, and each of those associations communicates information about the music we're hearing and the person who's singing it. But it's important to remember that point from the beginning. These associations are learned both by you and by the performer. They're not essential characteristics. Members of a group can sound different from what you'd expect, and singers outside the group can adopt the same vocal characteristics either intentionally or by coincidence. Like, you probably have some idea of what a woman's singing voice sounds like, right? I want you to try to picture it in your head. Got it? Okay, with that in mind, here's Angela Gossow. And here's Brian Aubert.
I've been waiting for this moment all my life.
Which one's closer to what you were imagining? So yeah, analyzing the voice is really hard, but it's also necessary if we actually want to understand how modern music works. And that's why I'm so interested in this model, not because it answers the questions, but because it gives us the tools we need in order to properly ask them. It offers a vocabulary to rigorously categorize different kinds of voices, which we need to be able to do before we can do any real analysis. So why not give it a shot? Try looking at one of your favorite singers through this lens and see what you find. Maybe leave your analysis in the comments, or don't. I'm not the boss of you. Speaking of vocabulary, my friend Devin, who you probably know from the YouTube channel Legal Eagle, recently made an entire documentary about legal words that people get wrong, and it's really good. He covers all sorts of different areas of the law, breaking down things like negligence, the insanity defense, and the difference between civil and criminal law in ways that are both easy to understand and fun to watch. If you want to check it out, the documentary called Bad Law Words Good is available exclusively on Nebula. If you haven't heard, Nebula is a streaming platform built by some of YouTube's top educators, including Devin and me, plus Adam Neely, Lindsay Ellis, Kat Black, Real Engineering, and more. There's tons of great originals on there, including my podcast, Ghost Notes, which I co-host with Noah from Polyphonic. We just released an episode about what it's like to be a professional public music expert, which is available exclusively on Nebula as well. If that sounds cool, or you want to watch Devin's documentary, the best way to get Nebula is with CuriosityStream. We've worked out an amazing deal where if you sign up for CuriosityStream with the link in the description, not only will you get 26% off an annual plan, you'll also get a Nebula account free for as long as you remain a CuriosityStream member. That's a full year of access to all your favorite YouTube educators' original series on Nebula, plus all of CuriosityStream's amazing documentaries, including their series Beyond the Spotlight, featuring an hour-long conversation with legendary actor and educator LeVar Burton, all for just $15. Again, link in the description. And hey, thanks for watching, thanks to our Patreon patrons for making these videos possible, and extra special thanks to our featured patrons, Susan Jones, Jill Sundgaard, Duck, Howard Levine, Warren Heward, and Grant Aldonis. If you want to help out and help us pick the next song we analyze too, there's a link to our Patreon on screen now. Oh, and don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.